Precious lemon ginger tea. So relaxing on a Monday when you don't even have to work. So, welcome to another edition of the Wandering Yuki Cheese Cafe. As you can tell with the tree in the background, you're seeing it's getting very close to Christmas time, and I'm on vacation right now, don't have to work, so I'm just taking it easy. And as much as I've been enjoying doing some of my wandering videos around the city and etc., I thought today let's just relax and do something at home to kind of, get back into some of my roots and get something that's a bit more grounded compared to my other wanders. And I thought, music is already a big part of my life. You already know that. You've seen a lot of my videos. And in fact, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can click on the top right corner and then you'll be able to see my end of summer 2023 episode where I kind of covered the evolution of the music I used on my channel over the last 3 years. And I kind of want to get back into that. Because let's face it, I've already done a few episodes on my music collection, and this idea came up a little while ago. I was thinking that people like to play 20 questions when they're trying to get to know someone, and I thought, wait a minute, you can do 20 records and you could probably get a similar thing. So what I thought I'd do is I'd dig into my collection that I have on my wall, and then just try to look for 20 good albums, not necessarily 20 of my top of all time, because that's kind of hard to narrow down. It's hard for me to do a top 10 list, never mind do a top 20. That's going to take forever. But I just thought, let's try to find 20 good albums and just see if there's anything I could talk about them or share some stories about my life, things that are kind of interesting about it, or some trivia. So let's get to this very soon. But before we do that, I have one suggestion for you to make. Hit that subscribe button below and put the notification bell to on. That way, if ever you have a new video that's ready for viewing, you'll get a pop-up on your phone. Oh, give me a thumbs up too, that helps. Now, you wonder where I'm gonna get the albums from? Very simple, I'm gonna pull it out of my hat. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. You're probably crazy, right? Well, duh, you've seen some of the episodes I've done on my channel before. Now, let's see what album number 1 is gonna be. Well, pulled out David Bowie, Scary Monsters. I guess it's kind of appropriate to start off with this one considering I am wearing a David Bowie shirt in the first place. If I was to think about any top 5 artists out there, David Bowie is definitely one of them because he's one of those guys that you were to listen to a record back in the day when he started, you would always see he'd be switching his style around. Like he would go from maybe 60s pop to glam rock to plastic soul, which was his name that he used for his version of R&B, to his electronica period where he was inspired by a lot of German art bands, and then even to his dance phase into the 80s. So he's one of those guys, like, you hear about musical chameleons, he's one of them, and that's kind of why I really dig his stuff. In terms of the album, the obvious hits would have been Fashion, Ashes to Ashes, and the title track, but the whole thing is pretty solid from start to finish. So much so that whenever he made another album that was like a comeback or really strong, all the critics would be saying best album since Scary Monsters. So it was always like a tagline. And he's one of my top guys. And actually, forgot to mention too that I used to check for compilations on him to see maybe what I could get to have the most number of songs, but then I realized these are all single cuts. If you go on the album itself, it's going to be longer cuts. So think of it this way, the song Heroes is 6 minutes on the album and 3.5 minutes on the single. Something to keep in mind. So what do we got for round 2? We have the Beatles' Revolver. I was exposed to a lot of Beatles growing up to the point that I actually knew a lot of the earlier songs. I'm talking about the Bubblegum Gum stuff, not necessarily the later psychedelic stuff that they had, but I did discover the rest of that over time. And then eventually I found that as much as I like the later stuff, Revolver became one of my personal favorites of the Beatles albums. Because it's like you still got some of the catchiness from the old style, and it kind of has some hints on what was to come. Like George Harrison was really starting to use a sitar on this album, and the one prior, Rubber Soul, with some psychedelic that got kind of trippy. So it's like a bit of everything. And this version I have is actually pretty interesting. I heard the stereo mixes that were released at one point where you might have had, let's say, the vocals coming out of one ear, some parts of the instruments are coming out of the other ear. So if you were listening to them on headphones, sharing it with someone else, chances are you'd only be hearing a portion of the song. This one is in mono, so it's only one speaker with one sound coming out of the ear. And it actually packs a bit more of a punch. But I also remember that this was one of my first big purchases when I was hired at HMV. It was around the time that the mono box set was released, so obviously I was going to have to pick up that one. Oh yeah. Deep Purple in Rock, released in 1970. This is actually something from my dad's era. I know he used to have that on vinyl and I still have it in storage somewhere. The cover always intrigued me because it's all the members of Deep Purple at the time, but designed to kind of look like the people of Mount Rushmore. And this was their first one they did, which is a really hard rock in style. So you got Child in Time, 10 minutes of long build-up, blistering solo, Ian Gillan screaming out his lungs. I don't know how he was able to speak after performing that, but it was heavy. And one thing about Deep Purple that was actually pretty unique was their organ sound. John Lord used to take a Hammond organ and then plug it in through a Marshall amplifier, so it gave it a bit of a dirtier, heavier sound and gave it a unique characteristic. So if ever you were listening to Deep Purple at the time, it stood out. What do we got now? Oh. And now for something completely different. Phil Collins' greatest hits. I'm gonna admit, I knew a lot of Phil Collins songs growing up because I used to hear it on the radio whenever we were doing drives out all around. I was pretty familiar with it. I kind of lost, but I didn't know it was Phil Collins at the time, so, I didn't have that knowledge. And then later on, I decided to get into his music, and I think what prompted me to get this, this was one of my very first CD purchases before I really became a music fan. So this had to have been around 2000, and I purchased it at Music World back when that existed. And I think it was one of our classes that we were doing the segment on homelessness, and then this song was shown for the lyrics to show what it meant. And then when I heard the song when they played it over, I thought, wait a minute, I know this one. And I went to go pick it up eventually. And I know Phil Collins gets a bad rap a lot of times because of his pop hits. People say that when he was in Genesis that he turned them from one of the greatest prog bands in the world to just a generic pop band, but come on, the pop was still pretty good. And that doesn't even talk about how he's one of the best drummers on the planet. Yep, bet you a lot of you didn't even know Phil Collins was a drummer. Rolling Stones, Exile on Main Street. I did hear a lot of Stones growing up as a kid, but I'm talking about their 60s stuff like I Can't Get No Satisfaction, Under My Thumb. Anything later than that I was not really familiar with. But also recall that this was early in my days of collecting CDs when I wanted to get everything under the sun. So I would be doing visits to the HMV in downtown Montreal before I started to work there. I remember I was looking for Sticky Fingers, and I saw that one was like 2 for $30. And then this was also 2 for 30. I bought this without having any clue what the heck it was on it. I guess if you're talking about singles, it had Tumbling Dice and Happy, and that's about it. But I could say that I wasn't too keen on it at first, but it's one of those things that when you keep listening to it, eventually the layers start to pick apart, and it's got a really good vibe from start to finish. One of those that you may not want to listen to a specific song, but when you start it, you're going to want to go to the end. If ever there was an album that kind of symbolized playing in your basement with the sound of hard rock, maybe the smell of cigarettes and the taste of bourbon all captured on vinyl, this was the one. Now let's move on to something else. Tears for Fears, Songs from the Big Chair. Now we're going for something completely different. We've gone through all this rock to basically 80s synth pop or 80s pop, but for the time that it came out, it was actually pretty sophisticated sounding and very deep. You know that the songs here shout, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and Head Over Heels? Those are the big ones. I heard when I was working at HMV, and I knew 2 of the songs, but I was really hearing Head Over Heels that made me think, I gotta buy this thing. It's very nice, if a bit somber and dark. You remember that I was sitting on the bus many times when I was finishing late from work, just sitting there listening to this, or just something about the music that fit the vibe at night. It's one of those things that's really hard to explain. Now let's move on to the next one. Presto. Ooh. Now, we're not going for a classic, but it's one I have a soft spot for. Rush, Hold Your Fire. Now, Rush is another one of those bands that's kind of like my top 5 I'm a huge fan of them. I love a lot of their classics, even some of the deeper cuts. I'm like one of those bands where I have the entire discography, so you can tell I'm kind of big into them. And I listened back to Signals, Moving Pictures, the 2 classic albums, and it always takes me back to 2006 when I was listening to them a lot summertime, and I was taking a summer class, doing an art class for some credits. Now, hold your fire. Force 10 and Time Stand Still are the only ones that are probably as known, unless you're a huge Rush fan. And it's not one of the strongest albums, but it is kind of warm, borderline romantic, or whatever romantic means for Rush. But I do have a soft spot because this got me through a tough time. It's one of 2 albums I was probably listening to on repeat when I was in the hospital getting appendicitis, well, basically having my appendix removed. The other album I had on rotation was Tom Petty's Greatest Hits. But funny thing is that of all the wards I ended up in after getting my surgery done, I was in the maternity ward for some reason. I guess it was an opening only over there, but you can imagine. I just got my appendix removed, and I'm surrounded by people who have just given birth and screaming kids. One of these things is not like the other. All right, what have we got next? All right, nice artsy one, and one that you probably wouldn't even think about. Iggy Pop, The Idiot. I know, when you think Iggy Pop, you think the Stooges, and the guy is still pretty chiseled for his age. I don't know how he does it. But this one's actually pretty interesting. It's his first solo album, and I think this was around the time when I was looking at, like, I guess what I could call 6 degrees of David Bowie, like, who played with David Bowie, what album, what producer, and then I tried to locate all that stuff. And this was one of those there, because it was also produced by Bowie, but I feel like that it was pre-Berlin area where, well, not Berlin area, like pre-Berlin period where Heroes, Low, Lodger, where he was going German electronica, was started over here. Almost like it was a prototype for it. And the interesting thing is that this has the original version of China Girl. Yeah, if you know the Let's Dance album, you know the song China Girl. That was co-written with David Bowie and Iggy Pop, and it came here in, I think, 1976. So yeah. It wasn't from 1983, it was from 1976. That's not gonna work. The Chicago Transit Authority. Okay, if you're anything like me, you probably heard Chicago growing up, but you were only hearing the Chicago ballads in the 80s. You know, You're the Inspiration, Hard to Say I'm Sorry, etc. This is their very first album that they released in 1968. And I actually didn't even realize that this sound existed for them because I only knew 80s ballads, and then suddenly this album was jazz, rock, blues, a blistering guitarist who even got the praise of Jimi Hendrix, and a horn section. I thought, what's going on? So there's a bit of a clash if you only know the later stuff in the 80s, but if you ever wanted to check out Chicago, do it. Check out their first 3 albums. I don't know, check out their early stuff. I said first 3 because their first 3 were all double albums for the time. And then their 4th album was a live album that was quadruple records. Not many people are going to have that kind of productivity these days. Ooh. Now this is a personal favorite of mine. Jethro Tull, Songs from the Wood. Now, I do enjoy the flute. I like folk music in my rock, and this one has a lot of Scottish folk. Or actually, Scottish folk was all across their discography, but this one, there's just something about it. Oh no! Ah, dang it. Luckily, it landed face down, so it didn't damage anything. But one thing I like is that mountains that kind of transport you to like a visual or some kind of a scenery. This I hear, and I kind of imagine that it's some kind of a fairy tale. I'm within the woods in Scotland, and it's a rainy day. A lot of this carries that vibe. It's very beautiful and quite nice. And what's next? XTC Skylarking. This is one of those albums that not too many people are gonna know, but when you're into music, you're definitely gonna know of XTC. These guys started like a kind of a post-punk band or kind of a new wave band, but kind of morphed into something completely different later on. They almost became very pastoral, very English, always quirky though, because Andy Partridge was a pretty quirky writer at the time. Skylarking is one of those albums, like the first one I discovered by them, because Some people at HMV were huge fans and I had to give it a listen. It almost feels like it's a summer album, like something you're lying down in on the grass, just sipping on some soda, lemonade, and taking it easy. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you've heard it, you probably know what I mean. The band. That is all. So, the band. This was pretty unique looking at the time. 1970, these guys all played with Bob Dylan, and the whole album feels like it's it almost gives you like a visual of 1800s Americana, which is ironic because only one of the guys was from Arkansas, the rest of them are all Canadian. It's one of those that I dig, but I really have to be in the mood for. Oh, if you're talking about songs that are kind of familiar from here, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down and Up on Cripple Creek are the two. And those I remembered hearing on the radio growing up quite a bit. Ooh. Doesn't get any more classic than this. Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. This is one of those albums that I already knew Don't Stop because I heard that a lot on the radio. But when I go through the whole thing, it almost feels like there's no weak track on here. Which is kind of ironic when you consider the turmoil they're all going through. 5 members all going through various forms of separation or divorce. Well, actually, 4 of them were all together, like 2 couples in the band. They're going through breakups. They're starting to see other people. They're writing about the breakup. They're writing about the new relationships they're going in. Not to mention that they have to see each other every day, and add to that copious amounts of cocaine and God knows what was in the studio. You can imagine that there was a whole bunch of crap going on, and yet somehow it became one of the best-selling albums of all time and an all-time classic. So somehow all through that haze of coke, they managed to kick this one out. Ooh. We're getting to something that's near and dear to my mom. Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Elton John's another one of those artists I heard a lot growing up, and I did start to check out his discography in university, and this one always stood out because it's got some good singles, good classics, but when you go through the album, it's a double album that doesn't really feel like it drags, and the styles are all over the place. You got your rockers like Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, you got some good ballads, even Funeral for a Friend, which is an 11-minute song. That is like very progressive rock, like almost unheard of for Elton John. Man. How did they come up with this stuff? How does so much talent come from one man? We're going for another change of styles now. Madonna, Ray of Light. It's one of those albums that I listen to the song, and it almost always transports me to 1998. Back in high school, I wasn't really thinking about much of the music like what I was into. I just know I was remembering the pop charts and how varied they were at that time. Because imagine, Madonna was on the charts with Lorena McKennitt, Backstreet Boys, Spice Girls, Chumbawamba. You think the music charts used to be very eclectic and all over the place. And I would even say that as much as I like some of Madonna's classic period, this is probably one of my favorite of hers, just because the electronica actually fits her vibe. Even some of the ballads are there, and some people would even say it's her best album vocally. But then when you remember she was training for the musical Evita, you'd really want to put everything into it. Kind of makes sense because this came around the time period after she did Evita, which kind of makes sense. What have we got next? Something kind of weird. So we got Frank Zappa, Hot Rats. I think everyone who knows me knows that I have a taste for some very weird, deranged kind of music, and Frank Zappa does kind of fit that bill because you know some of his music is very off the wall, well composed, but definitely kind of bizarre. This one I think is like the first real album of his I got into, and it's a pretty good one because when you listen to it, outside of knowing that it's Frank Zappa, it seems like it's a legit jazz album. The music is excellent in here, and it's almost all instrumental too, except for maybe one song, Willie the Pimp, which has vocals by Captain Beefheart. Ooh, Captain Beefheart. Now that's a guy I could probably talk about one day, if you want to end the party and scare everyone the hell out of the house. Time to pull a rabbit out of my hat. Or maybe, in this case I'm pulling out a raven. The Raven by The Stranglers. This is like one of those albums that I kind of discovered in my HMV days. feel like when I was working there, I learned a lot about different bands, different styles, and kind of opened up to a whole bunch of genres I wouldn't have given a chance before. I guess the best way I could describe the Stranglers is, imagine if they were the Doors, but instead of being an American psychedelic band, they're a British punk band, new wave band that added keyboards into it with a very heavy bass. And this one is probably one of the more artsy ones they've done, but I kind of love it. Baroque Bordello is probably my favorite track on here. I feel like I could use that track eventually if I discover a nice chandelier-like bar or restaurant. But that's going to be for another time. Well, I'm getting something kind of heavy now. And something Canadian. Devin Townsend, Ocean Machine. I think my first exposure to Devin Townsend was a colleague of mine at the store where he had shown me the Liquidation Bin, and I got the first Strapping Young Lad album for about $2. Strapping Young Lad was his project he did before doing his solo albums, and it was like balls to the wall heavy metal. This one's also kind of heavy, but also atmospheric because of the keyboards adding texture. And I kind of feel like that the way that the drums are tuned with the cymbal, it almost makes me feel like the ocean. Like when you're hitting the cymbal, it's like splashing water. I think I went to the lake near my house a couple of times listening to this, and it kind of felt very soothing at times, despite the fact there was some kind of screaming in the vocals. Yeah, it's like one of the few instances where I could dig screaming. I don't mind listening to it from time to time, but that is one of my favorites. And we're getting to the tail end here. All right, I think we're going to be going out with a bang. The Traveling Wilburys Connection. Did I say connection? Collection. Bloody hell. Well, what can I say about this? Imagine you're like 5 well-known artists. You're just a bunch of friends. You just get together for a jam, come up with a B-side for one of your other friends, and then turns out it to become one of the super groups out there, like one of the best ones. And I'm not talking people that have a low profile either. Basically, George Harrison, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, and Jeff Lynne all together. In case you don't know who Jeff Lynne is the main guy from ELO, or Electric Light Orchestra, so he does have some credibility. And the song I was talking about was Handle With Care. The 5 of them were getting together to jam on one of George Harrison's albums, and they came up with a song for a B-side, and the record executive apparently said, this is too good to just be hidden away on a B-side. So they got together, wrote an album themselves, no ego, and the result was this. Fine album from start to finish, and definitely one of my favorite discoveries. So there you go. That's 20 records. I didn't know if I'd be able to come up with 20 of them to talk about, but here we are. And I'd say they're all over the map. Great styles, and they tell a little bit about me as a person. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you're probably thinking there's other albums I could cover, so here's an idea. If you have something else you want me to talk about, or my own personal stories, leave it in the comment section at the end of this video, and then I'll see what I could do for another episode. Till then, thanks for watching this latest edition of the Wanryuki Cheese Cafe. Subscribe, like, and see you next time. And now, I'm gonna need to get some more tea. Forgot how talking on camera can really do a number on the voice. Wait, hold the phone, hang on a second. Hey, I only got 19 albums. Yeah, somehow when I was recording that on earlier in the week, I realized I only have 19 instead of 20. So I'm kind of an album short, so let's get the hat out and do a proper finale then. And what have we got today? All right, let's get this hat out of the way. And here's the next album, Black Sabbath, Master of Reality. I would say that Black Sabbath was probably my first legit metal band that I was starting to listen to, because other stuff that I've heard is borderline hard rock and maybe proto-metal, but these guys are considered the godfathers of metal because their riffing is very heavy, very down-tuned, and kind of set the stage. And I can honestly say that after hearing this, it let me branch out to other bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden for the new wave of British heavy metal style. Eventually made my way to, obviously, Devin Townsend that was here, and some other stuff. Even some like Viking death metal that I never would have guessed existed if I was in my early days of music collecting, but this stuff is cool. And what can I say about this? Children of the Grave, Lord of this World, Sweet Leaf. You probably know what kind of sweet leaf they're singing about. And that beginning where it just begins with some guy having a coughing fit in the studio, you know, it really captures your attention. And in terms of where I was in my life at that point, I can tell you this. Yeah, don't ask me how I pulled this out of my hat. Black Box, the complete Black Sabbath from 1970 to 1978. So this covers all of the Ozzy Osbourne albums that they released, so basically the original lineup. When I first started to be working, getting my own paycheck, and realizing I had my own money that I could spend, this was probably one of my first big purchases I made, because I knew that I had to get this to get some remastered albums. Pretty neat. And that's a wrap. So yeah, I have 20 albums finally, all varied, all different styles, and all covering different points in my life. And I probably only scratched the surface of my stories with this, so once again, here's my suggestion. Any music that you want me to talk about or albums that are worth covering, leave it in the comment section below and I can compile this for another episode down the road. Now, thanks for watching this latest edition of the Wanayuki Cheese Cafe. So to wrap things up properly, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button below, give me a thumbs up, and give me a thumbs up as a like, and share this video with anyone you think is going to enjoy it. Cheers everyone, and see you next time.